On first members in this debate.
Dr. Megan Woods.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and happy to take a call on this. As we've been sitting here on this side of the House hearing the members opposite chanting generic National Party lines about the brighter future and making business easier to do, and not a lot of substance on this bill, particularly from their second speaker. A lot of what we've heard today is, frankly, unbelievable. As my colleague Grant Robinson said, we've just heard from the last speaker about how emissions grew under Labor but shrunk under National, and what a proud record they have in this area. Let's actually look at this. Let's unpack this and let's look at some reality. So what we have is an emission trading scheme that Labor introduced at the end of its term, the bones of which National have been able to amend and actually reap the benefits of. But one of the real drivers of the drop in emissions under this government is that this is a government that has presided over a recession. And with a recession comes a drop in emissions. The members opposite should look to Russia. I know they have a problem with this part of the world, then Jerry Brownlee certainly does, but they should look at Russia and the staggering drop in emissions that Russia has experienced, largely due to the fact it's an economy in recession. But this is a piece of legislation that is absolutely critical to us as a nation. It is a piece of legislation that is absolutely critical to our future, and I don't think it's being treated with the seriousness opposite that it deserves. This is a piece of legislation that is about New Zealand doing its bit as a global player and addressing one of the key issues of our time and of our generation. And we have the member for Epsom opposite, who tells us that New Zealand is but a tiny contributor to this world problem and challenging other nations to do it. Well, I am proud to stand in this House as an heir to a tradition of a party that has seen itself as internationalist, a party that can make a difference. And I look to forebears on this side of the House like Peter Fraser, who certainly didn't think that New Zealand was too small to make a difference. And again, we saw our last Labor government realise that New Zealand could actually lead the world in this area. And what we have is we had the Honourable Nick Smith telling us that New Zealand's never had a greater reputation internationally than under the leadership of Tim Grosser. Well, actually, we're falling behind other nations. We are not a world leader. We are falling behind Australia. We are falling behind the Europeans, and we are no longer seen as someone who is leading the world. With this legislation that we passed in 2008, we're proud of, and it was legislation that was passed with support of other parties in this House, like the Green Party. But one of the other important things that we cannot decouple from our discussions around this is the very importance of us having an internationally regarded piece of legislation to reduce our emissions is on our trade and on our reputation and our ability to sell our products at a premium into global markets. Our environmental record and how we fit into the global environmental system is absolutely crucial to us as an exporting nation. We just need to look at the campaign that European supermarkets ran against New Zealand in terms of air miles to see what an impact that perceptions on New Zealand's ability to be an environmental player and to produce environmentally sustainable goods actually has. New Zealand had to put a lot of thinking and a lot of resource into countering this argument that a very cunning group of European supermarkets got together and did, and come up with the idea of carbon miles. And it actually was only because of our sustainable food production methods in this country that we could counter the air miles article and we could protect our access into a number of key markets. We will only continue to have access We will only continue to get premium, and we will only be able to move beyond being a commodity producer if we protect our reputation globally as a producer of clean and sustainably produced food. Labor opposes this legislation for many reasons. One that we'd like to very much address today, and my colleagues before me, Moana Mackie and Grant Robertson, have touched on, is this is rushed legislation. This is rushed to meet a December deadline, and again, to quote Grant Robertson, unbelievable. There are significant changes that should be subject to proper scrutiny in this House. This is serious legislation, and they should not be rushed through. Labor also opposes this legislation because it simply will not work. We were told ad infinitum that this was common sense legislation by the Honourable John Banks. Well, I prefer not to take my scientific advice from a man who's pushing the teaching of creationism in our charter schools. But actually what I'm also told, and I'd like to remind that member, is his colleague, John Boscawen, actually voted against the legislation and the National Party legislation, putting pay to actually a lot of what was contained in that member's speech. It actually makes it was incomprehensible to us because it just didn't gel. But actually it fits with what we're seeing before this House, which is a whole lot of revisionist history from that side of the House. And my colleague Moana Mackie would just like to assure the honourable member opposite that actually John Boscawen was a pleasure to work with in the last term when they worked on this legislation. All this piece of legislation does is chip away at legislation that was put in place. You know, it's kind of the backdoor way of throwing the whole thing out because it's going to be so meaningless. This is the obsession with tinkering that this government has. Rather than fix something, just tinker a little bit around the edges and don't actually confront any of the fundamental problems that are facing us as a nation. This absolutely achieves nothing. But what it does achieve, and what I'm not looking forward to going back and telling the good people of Wigram, and I'm sure my colleagues who, whether they be list or constituent MPs, are looking forward to going back and telling the people that elected them that actually they're going to be subsidising the polluters in this country. Taxpayers in this country are going to be shouldering the burden for reducing the cost of admissions for our polluters. That is not something that I'm particularly comfortable with telling people with already stretched budgets in my electorate, and I look forward to a progress report from members opposite of how the people that elected them feel about that. Another key thing that this bill does that is in fact dangerous is it reduces regulatory certainty. The flexible review positions that are contained in this bill does nothing to help business. It just creates a climate of uncertainty. Labor recognises that businesses need stability and certainty around their costs, and that they need to know what they are going to be facing as a cost of the emissions trading scheme. The ability contained within this bill of not only a 5-yearly review but an at-a-whim review does nothing to create that certainty. The government really should have worked to find a multi-partisan agreement around this legislation and changes. This is too important. This is something that we all need certainty around. And what we have talked about, and I'm going to address for the remainder of my speech, is the exclusion of agriculture and the fact that it should have an entry date. It is just ridiculous. It is just unfair to other industries that agriculture is getting the treatment within this bill that it does. What it does is it leaves other parts of our economy shouldering agriculture's share of the cost. We have a manufacturing sector at the moment that is bleeding jobs, but a government that has no idea of the drivers of this. They've shown this in recent weeks in this House. They have absolutely no idea what's driving driving it, and this piece of legislation is only going to make it worse. It's going to be damaging to the forestry industry and the jobs that are contained there. Forestry will be worse off as a result of this bill. There's a clawing back of the second tranche of compensation within here.
Sorry to interrupt the honourable member. Her time has expired.
Thank you.
I call Todd McClay.